Cool.
This summit can help ensure that artificial intelligence charts a course that benefits humanity and bolsters our shared values.
Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU, in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations, and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished panelists and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
So thank you, Anna. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from me as well. I'm Guilherme Martinez Roura from the International Telecommunication Union, and I would like to welcome you all for joining today's AI for Good webinar on Rehabilitation Robotics, Advancing Physical Therapy for Improved Health Outcomes, organized by the ITU. This session is part of the AI for Good Robotics programming track, exploring how AI-powered robots are helping to unlock our human potential and advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We have a distinguished set of panelists today, but as always, we are counting on you, the participants, to help create a very interactive session. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator today. His name is Olivier Lambercy, and he's the senior scientist tenure and co-director of the Rehabilitation Engineering Lab at ETH Zurich. Olivier, welcome, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Guillaume. Also, very warm welcome as well from my side to this exciting webinar on the topic of rehabilitation robotics. So my name is Olivier Lambercy. I'm a professor at ETH Zurich in Switzerland, where I'm co-directing the Rehabilitation Engineering Laboratory, and I'll have the pleasure to moderate this webinar today. So we're going to talk about robotics, wearable sensors, modeling, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and how these different technologies can be used to revolutionize healthcare, how they can help us better cope with physical disability, how they can also support better recovery from neurological injuries, or how we can use the health data that are generated by these technologies to improve clinical practice and the way rehabilitation is provided. So we have an exceptional set of speakers, all leading experts in the field, and they will give you a glimpse of their research on different ways robotics can support rehabilitation. They'll each give a roughly 10-minute presentation, and after the 4 talks, we'll have some time for discussion and for your questions. So please feel free to interact with us and to write your question in the online interface. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, David Rankin Meer. So he's a professor at the University of California, Irvine, and I think he's a good example of the interdisciplinarity of our field, as he's affiliated with the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, Anatomy and Neurobiology, Biomedical Engineering, as well as Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. So his talk today will be about insights into improving stroke motor recovery gained with robotic technologies beyond the lab. So David, I let you now share your screen. I'm very much looking forward to your talk.
Thanks, Olivier. Let's see. Let's see here. Okay, great. Well, thanks. It's wonderful to be able to talk to you about using robotics to help people with stroke. So I'm going to give you an overview of some of the work in our lab where we've made robots and sensor-based devices that we've deployed out into the community. And I'll talk about some of the insights that we've gotten from those devices. So some of the stuff I'm going to talk about has been commercialized, so I want to just disclose that to you. I've been participating in that, and then this is the crew of people that collaborated on some of the papers and the research I'm going to talk about, and then lastly, this is supported by NIH and NIDLR. So amazingly, about 1 in 4 people worldwide will have a stroke. And so we know that, so when a stroke occurs usually on one side of the brain and then the other side is affected. And about half of people who have a stroke have problems with their arms and hands on one side. Now you might say like, oh, it's a problem on one side. A person could just use the other side. But we know from wearable sensors now that when a person has a problem with one hand, they stop using the other hand as well. It's pretty highly correlated with each other. So people experience just a reduced amount of activity and a reduced amount of functionality and greater amounts of fatigue, for example. So the premise or the basis of the sort of field I'm going to talk about is neuroplasticity. And the primary view I have of that is that our brains are massively parallel. And so if there's a lesion caused by a stroke in one part of the brain, there's many other pathways potentially that you could use. And so the problem becomes one of searching for those pathways. So when I got into this field, we're thinking we want to make something sort of like this scene from The Matrix, where here's Neo back here getting just programmed to learn Kung Fu, and it all gets downloaded into his brain, and at the end of it, he knows Kung Fu. But until we can't do that, but until we can directly reprogram the brain, we need to use movement practice to reprogram it. But we know there's a big problem in current rehabilitation practice, which is underdosing. So this is probably what the dose response curve looks like in rehabilitation. This is actually data from a rodent model of stroke. But what we have here on the x-axis is the amount of rehabilitation the animal would do per day in reaches per day. And on the y-axis is the reaching skill of the animal. And you see this sort of hockey stick function. So, any rehabilitation is going to help. You're getting a little boost up here in your skill, but we really don't start seeing this like big effect of rehabilitation until 400, 500, 600, 700 rehabilitation or reaches per day. So this looks more like an elite athlete at a high performance training center than it does a typical stroke patient at a rehabilitation facility, where a patient might only get 30 to 40 practice movements per day. This is a huge problem in rehabilitation. So we're probably worldwide, even if you have access to therapists, you're probably operating mostly down here. So could we use robotics and machine learning and sensors to improve this and provide ways that people could practice autonomously or semi-autonomously? So here's a robot that we developed called NewRex. It's an air-powered robot. And this robot, it actually learns a model of the patient, and it learns how weak you are and how much help you need, and then it applies just enough help to help you, and you play sort of video games as you interact with the robot. And we compared in a clinical trial what happens when you do 2 months of training with this 3 times a week. And this is the change in your movement skill. This is a scale called the Fugl scale, but roughly it's change in movement skill. And you can see with robot therapy, it improves and you sustain it at 3 months. This is baseline 1, 2, post in 3 months. Conventional therapy, one-on-one with a therapist, you don't get quite as much boost. And these were in chronic stroke patients who was sort of are thought to have kind of plateaued, but they don't really plateau, and you can get a little bit more. So here we know that the robot is about as effective, or a little bit more effective, as the person, as a one-on-one therapy, at least for this very specific task of retraining arm movement. Now, we also know that robots can make therapy more motivating. So in this video, we have a robot exoskeleton that's helping assist finger movement as people play Guitar Hero, which is the third most popular video game invented. And the robot's helping them achieve hitting the notes at the right time. In this study, we had two groups of stroke patients. One got a high level of assistance, and one got a medium level of assistance. And we asked after each training session, how motivated were you for the training? And what we saw was that the high assist group consistently reported being more motivated to train. So this idea of like the robot helping you move, reconnecting your volition to successful movement provides a motivating context for people to do rehabilitation. So these types of results have been verified in large clinical trials. So these are a list of robotic therapy trials in a systematic review from 2021. The basic point here is that all these trials compared robot therapy to some sort of control group, conventional therapy. The line would be, the black line down the middle would be that the two therapies were equal, and if it's to the right, it means the robot was slightly better or better than the conventional. So you can see it tends to favor the robotic therapy devices. And I want to point out that no trial has found out that really more complex devices, more degrees of freedom, more sophisticated robotic actuation, even different types of algorithms. It just seems like the activity and the assistance provided by the robot is what does it. So with that, so now kind of second part of my talk, what are the caveats of robot physical therapy and how do we address them? One is that we did find actually that if a robot sort of over assist a person, that people will slack. And interestingly, we've discovered, that your brain has this sort of literally like a cost function that's trying to minimize between effort and error. And you have an algorithm in your brain where if something's physically helping you, you'll let it take over. And we know, if one thing we know in rehabilitation, if you become passive during it, then it's not going to work. Passive rehabilitation doesn't work. So you got to be careful in designing these devices to keep the person active and engaged. The other thing is that the robots have fairly high complexity and cost represented in this figure again. And as a result of that, and the fact that these are robots that can move, they often need to be sort of babysat by therapists. So in all those clinical trials I showed you, there was, I think in every one of them, sort of a therapist sitting with the patient. So it hasn't been sort of leveraged in a way to give really this sort of distributed semi-autonomous practice. So that's what we're focusing on now. So one thing we discovered is that we could replace the robotic actuators just with simple springs. So this helps in two ways. One is now, if the spring is sort of balancing your arm to give you assistance, it won't move unless you move. So we're addressing the slacking problem with that. And then the other one is it becomes a safer device because it can't move on its own and move your arm. It can't move your arm in weird ways. And so we were able to show that we could reduce complexity and decrease babysitting. This was commercialized by Hokoma, and there's about greater than 1,500 of these in use worldwide, called Armio Spring. But it's a $60,000 device. So we've started to say, like, how can we make devices that are much more accessible? So here's a device that we said, let's put it right on the wheelchair. About 80% of people with stroke are in a wheelchair soon after the stroke. So let's make therapy that's good, right, available on that armchair. So here you can see she's actually in stationary mode. And then we have a drive system where you can actually use that impaired arm to propel your chair, where normally you wouldn't be able to do that. So it's a way to engage in sort of a functional task. So we found that this is therapeutic, and we're just starting a larger clinical trial on that right now. We've also looked at sensors. So a lot of people, including myself, use step counters, like a Fitbit. So we made a Fitbit for the fingers. Here's a ring that's a magnet, and you can count how much people are using their hand here. And what we did was give people daily goals to use their hand so that you could get sort of therapy throughout the day. And what we found is that the group that received feedback and a goal did increase their hand counts modestly, and had a sort of modest improvement of their hand movement ability as well. So this is still sort of a holy grail for the field, is to develop wearable sensors that are truly useful for people with stroke. We pushed this research further using AI or machine learning. So now we can use, instead of putting a magnet on the finger, we can use sort of a neural network algorithm to detect finger movement just from the vibrations that it creates at the wrist. So you could use a traditional wrist tracker for that then. And then here's sort of the final one I'm going to talk about, is another sensor-based way to do exercise. So these sensors, very simple, have 4 sensors and inertial measurement units in them, and you can do about 40 different exercises. Here's a tapping one, here's a twisting one in the back here, and you can customize it. And so we found that even doing these simple types of exercises at home give you a pretty decent change in arm movement skill. This is early after stroke, compared to just doing a book of paper exercises, which is the standard of care right now. But most people do, literally over half, more than that, don't actually do those. So it's more motivating, and people actually has a simple movements can give you a pretty decent improvement in arm movement skill. What's cool about this is there's now over 10,000 FitMe users. It's sold by a company named Flint that I helped start. And what we found is that we can look at that anonymized data that comes back, and we find that perseverance is highly variable. So we do get about 3% doing over 100,000 reps. So we really want to study and understand what is it that helps people to go long times to get the amount of rehab that they need. And a couple of things we discovered is that, this is a game that they're playing as they play it, and you level up. So people that aren't able to level up, so have low success, they don't persevere. And you could probably guess that. But interestingly, if you level up every time you play it, you don't like it either, and you stop using it. So what we know is we have to kind of titrate success with these devices that based on sensing of where you're at. The other one was Sang-Jun Kim recently tried to analyze if the same phenomena that happens with the general population when you join an exercise gym is true for this home rehabilitation exercise after stroke. And the observation there is if you go to the gym when you first join at least 4 times a week, then you tend to persevere longer. And we found the same thing with the FitMe, which you can see on this right graph here, that people who exercised at least 4 times a week with the device had a much longer use period with it. So we're developing sort of AI chatbots to help people set goals and keep their goals now. So just to conclude, here's some of the things I talk about. So I think hopefully I've convinced you that robotic technologies, defined broadly as robots that can move, or actuators, sensors, and machine learning, can help us understand and improve real-life stroke rehabilitation, particularly if we can get them out into the field and get large data sets. The second is that hemiplegic arms are hungry for activity. So we have this situation worldwide where people just are not getting enough rehabilitation based on what we know about the level of movement practice that it needs to be given to drive brain plasticity. And then third, I just think we need to start keep cultivating new technologies. I see the field as still kind of sprouting, and that there could be a great diversity of technologies that could be brought to bear. And I do think that we can address some of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, such as the ones I've listed here, if we continue to do this. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, David, for this excellent presentation. So we will directly move to our second speaker today, Ana Luisa Treros, and she is an associate professor with the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering and the School of Biomedical Engineering at Western University in Canada. And she will talk about wearable mechatronics government for rehabilitation and lifelong mobility. Ana Luisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just click on that. All right. Welcome, everyone. It's my real pleasure to be here today to talk to you about my work on development of wearable mechatronic devices for rehabilitation and lifelong assistance. And this is work that is being done at the Wearable Biomechatronics Laboratory at the Western University in London, Ontario, Canada. So just the motivation for this work is to help support people who suffer from upper limb musculoskeletal injuries, for example, those that result from playing sports or due to motor vehicle accidents, as well as people who have neurological disorders that affect their mobility, such as stroke or Parkinson's disease. And a new motivation for our work has been in supporting the musculoskeletal health of astronauts, helping them to minimize the effect of low gravity environments, which causes bone loss and muscle atrophy. And what all of these have in common is that a rehabilitation process is required to reinstate the proper connections between the brain, the nerves, and the muscles, maintain range of motion and strength so that people can perform activities of daily living. So we know that there's current difficulties with rehabilitation. From the clinician side, they're produced by the fact that they're only able to spend a limited amount of time with the patients. They only get the story from what the patient is able to tell them without really knowing if the patients are adhering properly to the exercises, how much pain they are feeling, or if they're actually improving, making it difficult to properly figure out the right exercises to prescribe. And then from the patient side, the therapies can be often painful. They are very likely time-consuming, and it may be difficult for them to know if they're doing the exercises well. And it can lead to frustration not doing the treatment, and in the long term to chronic pain and lack of mobility. So a possible solution was the integration of wearable devices that assist the patient while they are in their home environment, such as the ones that you see in these videos. When we started working on these projects, we met a wonderful therapist at the Hand and Upper Limb Center in London, Ontario, who would construct devices like these using springs and elastic bands. And then he would also send the patients home with a little machine that measures muscle activity so that they could see on a screen when their muscles were actually contracting, even when they were too weak to produce any kind of motion. So we started to think that we could use those muscle activity signals as inputs to our smart devices to automatically provide motion assistance. So let me explain how this would work. Within a standard mechatronics system, we have sensors that perceive what is happening both within the device and in the environment. The information from the sensors is then used by the control system to automatically determine an action, and then it converts that action into an input into the actuators that produce motion. This is how all mechatronic systems work. But since we're now talking about wearable devices, we now have a human in the loop, which complicates the entire control system significantly. When the human is in the loop, we now have sensors that are measuring biosignals, such as forces, motion, and muscle activity, that are also used by the control system. The human might be interacting directly with the control system, for example, through a touchpad or any other user interface. And then this is the complicated part. The actuators will apply forces to the human, and the human will apply forces back to the actuators. And this interaction becomes quite difficult to model appropriately because the different muscles will respond differently to these external forces. And from the mechatronics perspective, the forces that are created by the body have to be considered as disturbances to the mechatronic system. And I think we're going to hear a lot more about this from our next panelist. But one way to minimize unwanted reactions from the body is for the mechatronic devices to interfere as little as possible with the regular body motion, except for, of course, for what it's trying to correct. So our musculoskeletal system tends to not deal very well with any kind of extra weight or limiting forces or pretty much anything that causes discomfort. And when the device looks like this, which is actually one of our first prototypes for hand tremor suppression, with lots of hard components and standard electric motors that are heavy, it is difficult for the body to behave normally and maximize the benefits that could be achieved from the wearable devices. Instead, it would be ideal that if we could reduce the size and weight of the wearable devices as much as possible, especially when we are talking about devices for the upper body. So the work we are doing is towards creating mechatronic devices that look less like the Iron Man and instead look like standard clothing or garments such as gloves, sleeves, or shirts. And for this, we incorporate our standard techniques of weaving, sewing, and embroidery. This has resulted in the design of novel textile sensors. For example, this one shown in the image, which is a sensor for measuring motion or force that is constructed by embroidering conductive thread into fabrics. What you see in this image is the silver sensor in the middle. And when you stretch it, which would happen as a function of motion, it results in a significant change in resistance that can be accurately measured. In fact, we get a fairly linear response as a function of the deformation. And similarly, we are developing the same type of sensors, but using a loom and weaving the conductive thread into the sensors. And so the advantage of using these manufacturing technologies is that they are very accessible, even for small communities in remote locations or low-income countries. So once we develop and optimize the designs, we can make the procedures available for everyone to build their own devices, which would, of course, would be ideal. Okay, so still on the sensing process, but working more with the interpretation of the data, as in this example of a muscle activity signal, which we can see is fairly noisy. What we know is that all of these signals, because they are noisy, are very difficult to interpret. So a great use of artificial intelligence is to improve the ability to relate what we are seeing in the data and what is happening in the body or what should be happening. So for example, we know that the muscle activity signals are different when the orientation of the arm changes, as in these two images. Or if the person, for example, is interacting with the environment and applying forces, or if the movements are fast or slow. And by collecting large amounts of data under these variable circumstances, we have been able to develop machine learning models that can be used to improve how we interpret the signals under these dynamic conditions, which overall improves the accuracy. And similarly, we know that the signals change in the presence of disease. So our work has focused on identifying features from the collected biosignals that can allow us to measure the health of the muscle. So for these metrics, we would see a certain value when the muscle is healthy, which would be quite different from the signal when the muscle is injured, but that when the person is reaching the end of the rehabilitation, the metrics start to look closer to how they looked in the healthy population. And the purpose of all this is to allow the wearable devices to respond appropriately to what the user needs, which basically becomes how do we move the actuators. But those actuators also need to be wearable and light. Our work in this area has been on the development of the twisted coiled actuator, which is formed by a nylon fishing line that is covered with a conductive material such as silver, and then hyper twisted into a cord so that when you pass a current through it, it will heat up and cause it to contract and apply a force. We can control it fairly well, as you see in the video, but our progress in this area has been more on developing cooling mechanisms so that the expansion and contraction times are similar. And we can then use artificial intelligence to model their nonlinear behavior and allow us to control them more accurately, with the eventual goal of having them embedded into a wearable garment, such as this one, that would use, for example, up to 5 actuators to support wrist extension. So to summarize, these wearable mechatronic systems will eventually work like this. So we have the sensors and the actuators in the wearable devices, but these are now soft, compliant, and adaptable to the human body to try to reduce unwanted reactions while increasing comfort. There is a control system that is then going to provide the intelligence to the device so that it can react appropriately to the needs of the user. The information from the sensors is first processed and cleaned to reduce noise, and then put into a database that combines the information from as many users as possible. So it's very critical that a database that is used for medical purposes, it needs to be as diverse and inclusive as possible. Otherwise, there may be bias introduced into the resulting models. The information from the database can then be used directly by the control system to improve its behavior, but it could also be used to develop models that help to identify what movements are happening or should be happening, as well as the computation of metrics that help us determine how healthy the muscles are. And as mentioned before, AI is critical to help us process the data better, to help us create models and metrics, as well as in the development of advanced control systems that can compensate for nonlinearities and disturbances in a more intelligent way. And I want to acknowledge that none of this would be possible without my amazing team at the Wearable Lab, as well as our clinical and technical collaborators and industry partners, as well as our sources of funding. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ana Luisa, for this very, very nice talk. So we keep our question for the end. So we directly move to the next presentation, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Steve Collins. So he's an associate professor of mechanical engineering at Stanford University, where he directs the Stanford Biomechatronics Laboratory. And his talk today will be about challenges and solutions in assistive device design.
Thank you very much, Olivia. It's great to be here. And it's been very exciting to hear some of the recent results already in this session. So as David and Annalisa described, limited mobility affects the health and well-being of hundreds of millions of people worldwide. And my research goal is just a little bit different from what you've heard so far today. We want to make walking easier for people with disabilities and for people who have to walk long distances in their work by developing wearable devices like exoskeletons and prosthetic limbs that help them to complete those activities more effectively. So this would be after a person has completed rehabilitation and reached their maximum potential unassisted, we'd like to give them a device that further enhances their mobility. And this problem is a lot harder than it seems, continuing with our theme of superhero examples. The popular image, even among many roboticists, my colleagues, is that the problem in designing this kind of device has to do with fancy power supplies or clever mechanical design or just cost. And I think everyone here agrees that that's not true. That's not the real challenge. And the real problem is that people are extremely complex. So even a simple seeming activity like walking requires excellent coordination of thousands of motor units controlled across trillions of synaptic interactions, tens of times per second. And, we've kind of, this activity feels natural to us. So we think we kind of understand how it works intuitively, but we don't actually. It's really beyond our ken. And compounding this challenge, each of us is unique, and we're all constantly changing as we learn and grow. So research has been trying to model humans engaging in these activities for decades, but systems with our level of complexity are intrinsically difficult to model usefully. And even in our best simulation models of walking, we don't attempt to model the nervous system. It's just too complex, even though we all agree, I think, that the brain is important in human behavior. So what this means for people designing robots that closely interact with humans is that we don't know how people will respond to some new device or even a new therapy or surgery or other intervention that we've dreamt up until we test it on people. And this has made progress in my field very slow. Traditionally, what we've done is to dream up a specialized device, build it, and then test it on people. And because we don't have a good model of people, unfortunately, usually the device does not help them. And also unfortunate, this approach takes years to test a single design idea. And then, the PhD student graduates or the company folds and we start over. So what should we do instead? Well, if our guesses as to what will help people are likely to be wrong, then we need to be able to empirically test new guesses as fast as possible. And we need to systematically incorporate knowledge that we gain along the way so that we make better guesses. And I'll talk about two tools specific to my application that attempt to do this. So the first is a tool we call device emulators. And these are hardware systems that are designed to be extremely versatile. So they're not product-like prototypes, specialized one narrow function and ready to become commercialized. Instead, you can think of it as a virtual reality system for your legs. A person gets the physical experience of interacting with some new device without the overhead of building it. And that allows us to evaluate new design ideas from a broad given class in days or minutes rather than years. The second tool I'm going to tell you about is called human in the loop optimization. And this is a form of model-free online optimization that allows us to search the vast space of possible designs more efficiently. And in this process, the way it works is that a user interacts with a device while their actual response is measured. And an algorithm systematically changes device characteristics, then measures the resulting changes in human response and adjusts the device repeatedly until the characteristics that maximize performance are identified. And what's good about this is that the performance evaluations that guide the algorithm come directly from the user, reflecting their full complexity and their individual needs, adapting alongside them. And we've been employing these techniques for the last, I guess, 7 years or so now. And to be honest, we have found that this works much better than we expected it to. And we've been surprised in most of the problems that we've applied it to. So for example, in this study, we found ways to substantially decrease the energy cost of running, which could be used to make products that make exercise more desirable and increase activity. We've also found ways to use ankle exoskeletons to greatly reduce the energy cost of walking, which could be used in products that reduce fatigue or increase a person's effective range. And ways to greatly increase self-selected walking speed here on a self-paced treadmill, which could be used in products that allow people to, say, cross the street safely or keep pace with their peers while on a walk. And a lot of our early work has been among young, healthy graduate student volunteers, but we found that these results have been translating very well to new populations. For example, among older adults who are beginning to experience mobility loss in their 70s and 80s, we can increase both speed and energy economy. We've also found that the approach seems to work well across many conditions and different devices. So this is a hip, knee, ankle exoskeleton, and it can approximately halve the energy consumption for the human user during fast or slow walking, while carrying heavy loads, or while walking on steep inclines, which could be used to, say, increase the range for aid workers in areas with sparse infrastructure. We're currently working on applying the approach to try to develop prosthetic limbs that improve balance on uneven ground, and exoskeletons that help people recover from large disturbances that would otherwise lead to a fall. That always makes me flinch a little bit. And I think my colleague from Harvard, Patrick Slade, will tell you about a collaboration in which we took this approach outside the laboratory in the next talk. So what does all this mean for improving health and well-being for humans? So we now have research prototypes that deliver large enough functional benefits that they outweigh the nuisance costs of these devices, the cost of having to put it on and charge it, and the discomfort at the interface with your body. So I think that it's only a matter of time, maybe a few years, before we see the first successful exoskeleton products widely used by people. And with luck, these will soon help people to be more active, be more socially engaged, and be more fulfilled in their lives. And they could even have a therapeutic effect, addressing some of the issues that David and Annalisa brought up. Now, probably these devices are going to be very expensive at first, but there's nothing intrinsically costly in this technology. And cost can be addressed directly during optimization, including it as a term during that process. So my hope is that at maturity and at scale, devices like this will be widely accessible to most people. But there's taking a step back, I think there's a bigger lesson as well, which is that human complexity confounds our attempts to design tools that improve many aspects of human life other than mobility. And in those problems, we should expect to fail repeatedly, because it's so hard. But if we use versatile systems for rapid empirical testing and algorithmic optimization to make our search systematic, we can find good solutions that help people. And this has worked well for us in addressing decades-long challenges in wearable robotics. It might be useful for the problem that you're working on too. I want to thank my amazing PhD students and postdocs who did all this research. And I look forward to answering your questions during the discussion session.
Thank you very much, Steve, for this fascinating talk. And you already made a beautiful transition to our final speaker. So our last speaker will be Patrick Slade, who is an assistant professor of bioengineering at Harvard University, where he leads the Harvard Ability Lab. And his presentation will be on AI for rehab, estimating outcome metrics and optimizing devices in the real world. Patrick, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the introduction, and I appreciated hearing all of those talks, and I feel privileged to be able to hopefully connect a few ideas and wrap up these thoughts of how we can use AI rehabilitation and how it can impact, as we've talked about, outcome metrics and optimizing devices to improve mobility. So as previously mentioned, many people face mobility challenges, and it's hard to get people the care and the access to rehabilitation that they need. And so we'll talk about a couple of different examples in this chat. And generally the solution and the goal of our lab is to democratize rehabilitation with wearable devices. So developing tools using robotics and biomechanics and AI models to try and address these challenges and effective for real world use. So the first major idea I want to chat about is estimating rehabilitation metrics in the real world. So today we talked about some different applications for upper limb stroke recovery and movement and also lower limb devices. And what these all share in common is we often have to estimate something that we care about, some patient outcome measure, some goal for rehabilitation. And we want to do this out in the real world so we can increase exposure to these devices and improve effectiveness of these different techniques. And so one case study I'll talk about today is a device where we were trying to capture the energy that you expend during exercise. And we'd like to do this with the most simple, low-cost, accessible set of sensors. And so this conceptual idea of how we can try and use AI to model some underlying system and estimate some patient outcome metric is I think, a very universal and potentially beneficial approach for different researchers. So to present a framework on how you could develop a wearable tool to estimate a rehabilitation outcome metric, sort of the first step of our approach was to collect data from both portable sensors, so things that are low cost and accessible and easy to deploy, and also gold standard sensors, so really capturing that underlying patient outcome measure that you care about. In this case, we were looking at energy expenditure, and so we use this big respirometry mask to get this sort of gold standard ground truth information. And we used a number of different portable deployable sensors on the body. And we can use AI models to try and infer the relationship between these portable sensors and this gold standard measurement. And this is really the crux of the problem. If we want to help move and estimate these outcome metrics in the real world, there has to be this relationship or this underlying model that we can build that can capture the outcome measurement we care about using simple and portable sensors. Once we have this data set, we can train models and determine how important different portable sensor signals are and be very thorough in exploring the trade-offs in accuracy and cost and accessibility of our different solutions. In this case, estimating energy expenditure, we determined that 2 inertial measurement units, IMUs, on one leg were sufficient for our task to accurately capture the energy you expend during exercise. Then we can take the sensors that we've selected, train our model, so relating again this portable sensor data to our ground truth outcome measurement using some modeling approach. And the last important step in this sort of generic paradigm is we want to take this model and evaluate it how we would in practice. So ideally deploying it with new participants, a diverse set of participants across many activities that we care about, to really understand and validate, is our system performing in the real world how we would expect it to in practice? And so this is hopefully a universal approach that may apply to different problems like stroke rehab, lower limb devices. And to highlight the outcome of our system, here's a participant walking with our device, and you can see the energy expenditure estimates with each step. And so we've learned this underlying relationship between movement and energy expenditure. And in this case, it seems fairly straightforward why that exists. Our muscles are burning the energy that we use to generate movement. And so by looking at the movement of the leg from these portable sensors, we can back out that information that we would typically measure with a laboratory signal. So this idea can apply to a lot of different applications in rehabilitation or assistive devices where we use AI along with portable sensors to learn some sort of mapping between easy to deploy sensors and some underlying and perhaps difficult to measure ground truth patient outcome. And by doing this, we can move these same rehabilitation tools or devices from a lab setting to a more portable at-home setting. And so for this project, we found that our system provided the ability to estimate energy expenditure with about 3 times lower error than existing portable solutions like smartwatches. And so that's shows the potential of this sort of approach. And I guess ongoing work in the lab right now is taking this a step further. And for this particular project, we're looking at actually how can we make it incredibly accessible by using a smartphone just in your pocket. And again, using this movement information and this AI model to capture this underlying relationship. The second major idea I'd like to convey to you is that we can use this same idea of modeling something, some underlying patient outcome, to optimize rehabilitation devices in the real world. So as Steve mentioned, we can use these lower limb devices, for example, an ankle exoskeleton, to try and augment our movement. In this case, try to reduce the cost of transport or the effort it takes to walk with our device. And so here we tried to leverage Steve's existing work on building these emulator systems and understanding this really challenging human-robot interaction problem, and transform this personalization approach into a portable system to really extend it so you could use it at home or you could use it out in the wild. And I think this broadly applies to many different rehabilitation settings and devices. So Steve talked about this approach, human loop optimization, where you have the human interacting with the robot, and you have some underlying biomechanical measurement that you care about that you're trying to improve. And so you use an optimizer to update this control law. We can take this exact same sort of lab-based framework and just add in our AI model, very similar to what we just talked about, where we can relate wearable sensors to this ground truth biomechanical measurement we care about. And now we can take our system and make it portable and take it outside of the lab and perform the same sort of personalization approach to try and maximize the benefits of this device. So for this collaboration with Steve, we had our device, we had people put it on and walk around with it in a naturalistic way, changing speeds, walking in short bouts. And as the person put on the device starts to try out different controllers in this optimization framework and slowly figure out what is best for each person and personalize this assistance. And the underlying result was that personalizing assistance about doubled the effectiveness of the device compared to a generic controller. So this really shows that if we want to maximize the effectiveness of our rehabilitation tools and devices and just generally approaches, personalization is very important. And as was alluded to in several presentations, this is even more important for patient populations with different levels of functionality and different levels of engagement. And so this approach can be something applied to many different problems and can really try and improve our effectiveness of these devices. So key idea here is we can use these machine learning models again in this sort of optimization approach to improve performance. And so here we've talked about how we actually went from a lab-based device to develop a portable device using this idea, but the same concept can be used on existing portable rehabilitation tools. And so quickly, I'll talk about an example of that. So We, as another project, I developed this cane, which is aiming at improving navigation for people with blindness. And so here we have many different sensors to perceive the environment and help people navigate from point A to point B safely. And it's a very complicated challenge. You need to understand where you're going along a route. You need to avoid collisions. You need to detect key objects like signs or crosswalks or environmental interaction. And so it's a really challenging human-robot interaction. And I think this highlights a lot of the difficulties in different rehabilitation robotic settings. So here we had a device that we had designed, and it provided some benefit, and I'll talk about the device a little bit. But the idea is you can take an existing tool and apply this human-in-the-loop optimization approach, especially with this portable AI model, to make it accessible and deployable in a wearable setting. And this can still improve the performance of an already beneficial device. And so it's something that you can just drop in and try with your existing setup and see if you can improve performance with just some simple software changes. So here's the device, and you may hear the audio feedback from our system. So in the middle, you see the camera view of what our system sees.
Sidewalk.
On the left, you get a depth image. You can hear as we approach an object, we're giving feedback to help the person avoid collision. And we're also helping them navigate at the same time. So on the right, you can see a segmented image into a crosswalk and a curb and a sidewalk. And you can see an arrow of how we're trying to steer them to follow GPS points. And again, avoiding collisions. And so in this case, it's a really complicated interaction problem, right? And fortunately, we were able to come up with a generic controller that helped people increase their self-selected walking speed. But by optimizing this really complex feedback that we were giving participants, we were actually able to increase walking speed again by an additional 26%. And this is still early piloting in our laboratory, but it's promising to show that we can apply the same approach to existing devices. So to summarize, we can use AI tools to improve rehabilitation and try and translate these devices and improve effectiveness in the real world, both by capturing rehabilitation metrics with portable sensors and also optimizing devices to improve performance. And I'd like to thank my advisors. A lot of this was a portion of my PhD and postdoc work, and also the wonderful students in the Harvard Ability Lab that are pushing all of these projects forward and helping us to explore further.
All right. Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you everyone for this very nice presentation. So now we'll have a bit of time for discussions. I suggest everyone can turn on their cameras again, and we are happy to take a few questions from the audience. So if the audience has questions, please put them in the interface, and we'll bring them in here. Maybe let me start with a bit of a more general question first to David. So I think you very nicely discussed in your talk this question of complexity of rehabilitation technologies that we use for the upper limb rehab in particular. So comparing multi-degrees of freedom robots to rather simpler sensor-based wearables. So in your opinion, for all the persons that listen to us and that are developing the next generation of rehab technologies, what's the best approach in terms of complexity? It's like, where should we go for? What should we go for?
Well, let's see. I think, I don't think we know the answer quite yet. I think that more complex systems allow us to test more ideas. And I think you saw that with Steve and Patrick sort of having this complex simulator, for example, allows testing of more ideas more quickly. So the simpler systems seem like they're necessary right now in the way rehabilitation delivery systems work and the way people interact with objects. Rehabilitation during rehabilitation, it doesn't seem like complex things will get used very much unless they're sort of have huge benefits. So things right now, the way the field is, need to be able to be put on in like a few minutes or and not overwhelm people. And therapists need to feel like they're not going to break something, and patients feel like they're not going to break something. And so, in terms of efficacy, it seems right now that the simpler devices are working about as good as the more complex devices. So in terms of sort of in-place rehabilitation, yeah. So there's just some thoughts. I don't have I can't tell you like, go simple because that's the future. I do think simple is the pragmatic thing to do right now because it seems about as effective and it fits in with what people are willing to actually use. But the complex devices still might prove necessary. They're certainly necessary scientifically.
Yeah, I get your point. So probably we still need both, right? Maybe I bounce the question back to Steve. So do you see the more complex robot as a good way to design maybe simpler systems?
Yeah, I think David articulated this really well. Having a very versatile system early in the development process means that you can test out lots of different ideas, including simplified systems that are captured within that more complex thing. So, for example, in some of our studies, we've constrained the optimization space to only passive devices. Yeah, so you can compare what's the best version that's energetically passive that could be accomplished with, say, just a spring to something that has a motor. And so you can tell what's the trade-off. And then you can make an informed choice. This thing will be lower cost and easier for people to use. And it will also deliver a little bit less benefit. So I guess in this case, we should prescribe people the simple spring-based system. In some of our work on exoskeletons to augment running, for example, we found power from a motor made a big difference where I think if you're trying to make a product, in that case, you want to take the hit of adding motors and computers. But it's gonna depend on the population and the task that you're trying to assist.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Maybe quickly to Ana Luisa. So you presented to us like very nice wearable device, integrated sensors. So where do you see there the main advantage in such like soft design approaches compared to the more conventional like stationary robot?
Yeah, I think both of them have their place and their use, right? Like there's some of them that have to be large and heavy to be able to provide the right amount of support. I think that the wearable soft devices are more for everyday use for people who have perhaps an imbalance in their muscle strength, or there's small corrections that are needed for their biomechanics, as opposed to the replacement of a muscle that is not functioning anymore, or for example, people with Duchenne muscular dystrophy that you would have to lift the entire limbs. So in those cases, of course, you would need bigger devices. But for people who have chronic pain that is probably caused by a lack of balance in the muscle strength or poor biomechanics, more intelligent systems that provide small adjustments of the motion would be necessary. And this is where the soft wearable devices come in. And just to touch a little bit on what was asked before, I think that having them as simple as possible is, of course, the best, right? So start simple and then add complexity if the functionality isn't there. I think that's what would need to be added.
So as simple as possible and as complex as needed. Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, that brings me kind of to another question, which related to what we've heard in several of the talks. So bringing this technology home or outside of the lab, right? I guess most of us would acknowledge that this is where rehabilitation needs to go. But what do you all see as the main challenges for a technology to actually make it to people with disability and also to collect this data in the field? And I'll maybe give that one to Patrick.
Oh man, I think probably David's a bit more qualified in the translation aspect, but I would add one comment of, I guess this question and the previous ones are somewhat interrelated in that I think there's sort of two separate challenges. One is, as Steve alluded to, it's really hard to determine the best human-robot interaction for a given setting. And then there's an added challenge of then how do you simplify and deploy it as minimally as possible, as was mentioned by Annalisa and David. And so I think trying to first identify, and I think research is a great opportunity to do this, where you can do these calculated lab tests and hopefully get a very good idea of this human-robot interaction that you need, and then try to simplify and minimize all the capabilities and requirements of the system to translate it and make it something that's easily usable while still providing this sort of best case benefit. But I would definitely be curious to hear David's approach to launching these, especially given his the widespread use of these different IMU systems.
Yeah, I was going to say, interestingly, the problems become one more like what's the business model? And I think we all get into this, and we sort of, I've heard this so many times. I used to say this, like, I want to make as cheap as possible a device, or so it can be widely used. And that's very, very naive, where what makes a device get potentially widely used is that it's part of a functioning business ecosystem, because you have to have people marking the device, making the device, marking the device, picking up out of a warehouse, putting it in a package to get it to someone. And those people need to go home and feed their families and be willing to do those jobs. So I think that I'm going to take that approach, is that a good idea isn't good enough. It needs the whole business ecosystem to work. And that's really tough in rehabilitation because of the way reimbursement works. So the devices that we succeeded in getting out, so for the expensive device, the spring, I think a lot of hospitals sort of buy that to be sort of cutting edge, and maybe they get grants to do it or things like that. But for the low cost devices, like the FitMe pucks, these things, I guess that's not showing up, but these, we decided we could make them cheap enough to just like ask people to buy them out of pocket. So they're like $300. So we're just kind of skirting the need for the whole reimbursement thing, but that has limits too, because you got to have $300 to do it. Anyway, that's I don't know, maybe it's a little bit of a different perspective, but I think that integrating it into discovering business models that work for these types of technologies, and that's particularly hard in rehabilitation, I think.
Yep, absolutely agree with you. Steve, you want to comment?
Well, just to add on that, at this moment, you don't have examples of companies that have, made hundreds of billions of dollars on this kind of product, and that is a limiting factor. My hope is that you get a few consumer device successes that really galvanize investors, so that they're willing to take more risk on these kinds of hardware projects in this space, and that could make it more feasible to bring together the team you need to make one of these products real.
I was just going to add, it'll be interesting because I think, and Steve could comment on this too, but my impression is like all the initial exoskeleton companies had that tried to kind of had that went public, for example, that you can track stock, had large valuations, and then it all has not panned out very well. So that's going to be interesting to see. And I think there's probably at least 5 maybe that did that. So it'll be interesting to see if that initial experience, how that affects sort of investment going forward. But
right, that's unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but it adds to the idea that we need to have really effective devices, hopefully, to overcome that hurdle. And I guess one comment that I'll add, because in the last year I've been thinking about how we translate these devices, and I don't have any real experience in the same way that sort of the project you've talked about, David, but it's clear to me that there is this viewpoint difference between ourselves and folks funding rehabilitation devices, where we are focusing sort of on a need-based approach where we try to solve some problem for people that really have some mobility disorder. And then the VCs also say that they are need-focused, but their need is maximizing profit margins. And so they do want to help people, but I think there's just this slight misalignment that becomes tricky. And I think it's important for rehabilitation researchers to try and tell our story from their viewpoint, or try and, make sure that aligns. So I think like what you're saying, it makes a lot of sense in terms of it can't always be the cheapest possible device, but it needs to meet the measurements for a successful business model, and also hopefully treating some rehabilitation process.
Yeah.
Ana Luisa?
Yeah, just to add a little to that, I think there's perhaps too much rush in trying to get the devices commercialized. And then what happens is that they don't work as expected, especially for the general population. And so there's a disappointment, and people start to think that things don't work. So I think as researchers, our goal is of course to get them to the point where they're helping people. But we have, within the lab setting, we have to be working on big, complex, expensive systems that can then be optimized, and the costs can be lower for use in the general population. The frugal design approach, it comes to mind, where you're really optimizing. So you develop a big system and that's expensive, but then you really optimize it for the individual, you optimize it for the type of disease that you're trying to support, and that becomes a lot less expensive to produce. But by the time it actually makes it to the market, it's a validated working system. So that's just what I wanted to add.
Yeah, a very good point. Let me just move on to a few questions we received from the audience that are.
Can I say something real quick? Because I just thought of something else I'd love to say. Sorry, Olivier. But I think it's important. Ana Luisa had an excellent point where she, or in her talk as well, where she was showing these types of sensors that could be made locally. And so I talked about this business model, but I do want to say that model too can work. And I know it's worked in prosthetics. There's some sort of low-cost prosthetics that have been deployed worldwide that you can make with just like a drill press and a bandsaw, for example. I know my friend Roger Gonzalez trying to remember the name of the organization, but there certainly are organizations that have succeeded in sort of teaching sort of local manufacture of technologies, and that's I think that's a bit of a different model. So although you still need to support that local industry, but I thought, Ana Luisa, that was really cool. That's a neat way to do it as well. So if we could make really useful things that could be manufactured locally, almost in like crafty hobby kind of ways, that could be really cool too, to get widespread usage. And then we have and just one more point, and we have people worldwide have cell phones almost everywhere. So then you have a way to get data, and you have computation local, embedded. So almost everywhere in the world it has that. So anyway, that's it.
Okay, let me just save some time. I mean, the business side discussion is fascinating, but let me just save some time for the question from the audience. So we have one specific question for Steve. So did you observe any fundamental differences in the outcome of human-in-the-loop optimization between the young and the elderly population, or probably different types of population, or how this would generalize, or in the way the user perceived and adapted to the assistance, basically?
It's a great question. It's a little preliminary to make broad claims, but in our small N=10 studies with older adults and younger adults, one of the main differences we found is that it seems that the older adults adapted to the exoskeleton more slowly than our younger participants. So in order to get a benefit from these devices, the person has to become an expert in using them. All the outcomes we care about are on the human side of the system. So it's really about how the human changes in using the device. And that can take a long time, a few hours of exposure to get the most benefit from these tools. And so that suggests that if we were to try to, say, perform that training in a laboratory setting or clinical setting, it would take a long time. For older adults, it could take a long time. And probably we need to rely on at-home training approaches where people are continually adapting while the device is co-adapting to them.
Yeah. So I want to drive back the discussion towards artificial intelligence. It's part of the topic, so it links a little bit to what you just said. So I think you have all been using some form of artificial intelligence since many, many years. But how do you now see kind of the boom of artificial intelligence from these last few years for specifically the field of rehabilitation technologies? So where do you think AI will really be, or is or will be soon, real game changers?
Can I make one quick comment on this? And so Annalisa mentioned that she gathered a lot of training data in her EMG study, and that really connected with me. I feel like the main challenge we face is a lack of sufficient training data to apply the same kinds of ML approaches that, for large language models, things like that. In those cases, they had this huge training data set, and then they made good use of it. So one of the things I hope we can do is to work to develop those data sets. And an initiative that's coming out of Stanford right now that I'm very excited about, this is led by Karen Liu in computer science here, is called Add Biomechanics, AddBiomechanics. And that is a website where it performs part of the processing of motion capture data for the clinician or scientist, and gives you like a scaled OpenSim model. So it saves you several hours or a day worth of work for one, say, collection day of your human subjects data, using these kinds of optimization tools, AI, I guess you could say. And then it provides it to you on the condition that you share your data set with the broader community. And this is in a pre-release stage still, but you can use it. And I think we have tens of thousands of motion capture trials in a public database, all in the same format right now. And if we get that database or other databases like it big enough, then maybe we can start to use data-driven approaches to answering questions like, how does the nervous system coordinate movement, and how does it learn to adapt to some new environment, which I think is very exciting and would have profound implications for rehabilitation and assistive devices.
Yep. I guess to add on to that, in the vein of obviously having big data sets would really allow us to deploy these more powerful AI tools that we see in natural language processing and image classification, things like that. I guess we're learning to incorporate domain knowledge related to movement in small models. I guess the projects that I had talked about today are really using pretty simple statistical learning methods, some more complicated than others, but the idea being that if we can try and use some underlying biomechanical information or musculoskeletal modeling information, this can be one way to try and augment, say, a small experimental data set for a specific problem. And so I think that is another exciting approach and different set of methods that we should explore, and how we can integrate as much information as possible. So we're not learning some objective function or some function that is purely based on data, but it can encode, say, a lot of the physics that we know are going on in movement or in our neuromotor control.
Yep. Anybody else wants to comment on that? Yes, Annalisa?
Yeah, just to comment on what Steve said, I think we've been talking about developing an upper limb database for at least 8 years. And then the difficulty becomes that there's so many different actions that we do with our upper body that it becomes a lot more difficult to standardize how the data are collected so that we can put it into a common database. But I agree that that is absolutely necessary. And again, trying to make it as diverse as possible so that we can address any issues with trying to reduce bias as much as possible. So that would be even harder, right? Because it is probably easier to collect data from in laboratories where there's a lot of funding compared to perhaps lower income countries that would be difficult to capture the data from those populations, and then whatever data set we have is going to be biased towards the people that belong to the data set, right? So then it becomes our job as researchers to make sure that we are making informed decisions on the use of that data, so that we're not trying to generalize to people who are not included in that, but at the same time trying to extend it to try to figure out what the differences are and how to support more people better. So that's one aspect of the data set. And the question that you asked, Olivier, about the use of AI, I think that once we have these big training sets that we can then develop large models, answering some of the comments that I've seen coming in, is that then we can tailor them to the individual, right? So we could try to find within the data set people that match as best as possible the characteristics of the person who is using the device, not just the physical characteristics, but any kind of other socioeconomic factors that should be included in the way the data are analyzed, and use that as the basis, and then just some small calibration for each individual. There's lots of work to do in that area still.
Yes, David?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that too. Coming from the rehabilitation therapy perspective, I think AI could be really useful in designing for habit formation. So we know that right now, people just don't exercise enough. It's true of the general population, but it's particularly true after you've been having a neurologic injury where it's a lot harder to move, a lot more effortful, and you might not feel stable when you're walking, things like that. So designing for building good habits, I think AI could really help with that. And I think a key thing that could go with that is, just for lack of a better term, is chatbots that work as sort of smart therapy coaches. And that, with the large language models, it seems like you have more natural forms to communicate and convey information to people. So I see that as having a lot of potential. The other thing I want to say is, with Steve's idea of having a general device and then measuring, so for example, energy consumption, and then optimizing in real time. And Patrick was doing that out in the real world. I think when we talk about plasticity and rehabilitation therapy, the issue becomes that you don't see the effects of the plasticity till days later, or at least overnight. So it becomes much harder to do it in real time. And that's what makes this field so hard to optimize rehabilitation therapy, because it's even harder because you can't just measure oxygen consumption, it seems like. But you got me thinking, like, what if we had biomarkers of effective therapy so we know, based on the way your brain's reacting, or the way your muscles are working, or the way that you're breathing, or the way that you're interacting, that's going to be an effective way to be training right now. That would be beautiful, right? So you could get
That would be cool.
That would be cool. So then you could sort of optimize around that. And I do think AI it's probably going to be multifactorial. You can involve brain signals, muscle, biomechanics type info. So AI could, maybe it's almost like, you have like it's like your heart's in the target zone, right? That's when you exercise, your heart's in the target zone. But what we want is your brain in the target zone, right? And we want a set of sensors that are using AI to say, like, hey, what you're doing right now, you're in the target zone. That looks really, really good for your brain. And if you keep doing that, we know it's going to have a long-term positive effect.
If you had a large data set, you could retrospectively go back and try to find those biomarkers. The full instrumentation and retrospective sensor selection and signal selection process could work there. That would be really cool. Maybe we should I think we've got the right PIs here for a proposal. Let's do this.
I think that's a great idea. And just one comment on that quickly is, I agree that it's, even, I guess, the long duration of some of these challenges could be potentially seem like a barrier to performing this sort of optimization. But given that you have these devices at home and you are trying to increase exposure with them over time, that does provide still a lot of information, even if it is delayed or pretty complicated, that offers some opportunity for optimization, or even, and I guess I was hoping to mention this, but I forgot. In the same way that we can optimize like a device or the specific feedback, we can also optimize biofeedback or participation, for example. So even with the chatbot example that you mentioned, if your goal is to just increase the number of reps per day and this sort of motivation, I guess, metric, that could be a whole separate optimization of how do you develop the chatbot to interact differently or to prompt people differently to personalize that aspect, and then ideally result in a larger number of reps or whatever could correlate to improvements in outcome.
Okay, let me open a little can of worm there. I'll probably regret it afterwards. But so, do you see any risk in using AI in the field of rehabilitation? I mean, for example, think of convincing your clinician or your user to now trust an AI model that would take, to some extent, some clinical decisions. Is it something you experience as a resistance from your partners, from your collaborators? You want to comment on that?
I mean, immediately what comes to mind is the AI is going to be wrong sometimes, just like driverless cars and just like large language models that hallucinate. So yeah, that's certainly there is a risk when it's wrong, right? I think that's true.
I think another risk is the data, the possibility for a data breach or the data to be lost, or even someone trying to capitalize on people's data, right? And so that would be my concern, right? Like who owns the data? Who owns each person's data once it's in the system? It's not anonymized anymore, right? Like how much are people willing to pay for access to that data, and what are they going to do with it? So that would be, I think, probably the biggest ethical concern with these databases and what AI could do with it.
And I guess to allude to your point earlier too, which was a great one about including diversity in our data sets, I think that is a potential challenge there. If we have some model trained and it's not inclusive of all the patients that it may be used for to assist or to determine outcomes, that could be a potential source of bias and error. And in general, I think these different ideas that are mentioned are trusting purely black box models in this case where potentially there's physical harm that could occur is sort of a risky scenario. And so we need to have methods for verification, or perhaps integrate, I guess I plugged this idea before, but integrate something about our, physically realistic movement or some sort of domain knowledge as a sanity check for these models, so that we don't just trip someone on the stairs or have some sort of weird error.
Another thought too, kind of getting more fundamental, is like, I think we need to ask ourselves, are we making a mistake if we're taking humans out of the loop too much? Is that a fundamental mistake? So when I started my postdoc 30 years ago, Dudley Childress, who was a very famous prosthetist or prosthetics researcher, and he also invented the sip and puff switch, which to use to drive wheelchairs. I sort of presented my idea of using robots for helping do therapy, and he said, well, what about the human touch? And we know, for example, that there's an affective, emotional side of touch, for example, of the human touch, and that there's something about interacting with the person that's so important in our lives. So I think as we talk about AI systems and things like chatbots and semi-autonomous therapy, like making sure that we're considering sort of the human side of things as well, and keeping people embedded in community makes sense. So.
All right. That's I think a very good point. We need to slowly get to a conclusion of this session. So I will ask more, maybe a last final general question. I think David had a very nice point when we prepared this, which was, according to you, what do we not yet know but need to know to make rehabilitation technology or rehabilitation robots that are more effective or that are better in general? So if I put it in other ways, for all the scientists that are listening to us now, what should they focus their career on to try to have an impact in rehabilitation? Is it about, generating those big data, or is it going into a different direction? I would be happy to hear your thoughts on that. Maybe David, you should start because that was your question.
If I knew the answer, I wouldn't ask it. No, so it was, but I think it's come up multiple times in multiple talks is that we don't have good models of the way that motor control works and motor learning works. And that relates to the idea of a sensor that says like your brain's in the target zone, for example. And so I think, yeah, having a fuller fundamental understanding of the way things work, both at the real-time control level, but also in the plasticity changing level, would help us immensely. Because otherwise you're kind of going in blind into these systems.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts? Okay. Patrick, you wanted? Okay. Good. So I will take that aspect. So not just focus on AI, but also get to understand the mechanisms and the neurophysiology. And okay, I see we still have a little bit of time. Or Guillaume, you want to come in?
No, please continue the discussion. It's very interesting. I was just turning on my camera.
Okay. So I could
go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add that, yes, of course, if we had mathematical models, that would be ideal. And yes, of course, we've tried to develop them and to optimize them because it would be the easiest way for the devices to respond. The issue is that the body changes so much from one time step to the next time step that then this is where AI comes in, trying to get the control systems to adapt in real time to how the body is changing. And I can use tremor, Parkinsonian tremor, as an example for this, because we've done many studies with tremor. It is just so variable. And it changes from one moment to the next within the same person. And it's very difficult to predict. So we've tried to incorporate models that allow us then to try to identify what's going to happen in the future, which is basically what we need for the devices to work in real time. So yes, ideally we have these mathematical models, but AI helps us then to use what we have and optimize them in real time for real time use.
I would just building on that, say that ideally we would have predictive models. And I think AI presents us with a suite of tools that show promise for developing those models. If we don't have predictive models, then just as you say, in these complex systems that exhibit time-varying behavior, then we need online optimization, I think. That's the sort of model-free-ish online optimization is a great way to address those challenges of lack of predictability, individualization, and time-varying adaptation in the person.
Right. So fantastic. Thanks a lot for all your input. I think it was a really fantastic presentation, great discussions, lots of food for thought for everyone. And now I'll thank everyone again, and I'll hand the word back to Guillaume for the closing.
Yeah, sure. No, that was fantastic. So a big thanks from me as well to Steve, Ana Luisa, David, Olivier, Patrick, as well to all the participants for making it such an interesting discussion. We had lots of great questions and amazing insight into rehabilitation robotics and really looking into what do we need as well to have an impact, like a real impact in rehabilitation for humankind. And we encourage you to check out the AI for Good program online to see more robotic sessions that may be of interest to you. And especially if you have a robotics startup working on solutions for the Sustainable Development Goals, we encourage you to apply for the next Robotics for Good Innovation Factory until next Tuesday. And this is the end of this section and the start of the networking in the AI for Good Neural Network with the panelists and participants for the next minutes. So see you all in a couple of minutes. And now I will give the floor back to Anna for the closing information. Thank you all.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the eShop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for Good.
AI is a powerful tool.
This summit can help ensure that artificial intelligence charts a course that benefits humanity and bolsters our shared values.